Today we're in Acts 25, verses 1 through 12. And just a heads up about the next few Bible readings from this chapter, they're going to feel very tedious. And I know it's weird to call any part of God's Word tedious, but I think Luke does that on purpose. I think Luke realizes that this chapter is really hard to read because nothing new happens. I mean, yeah, we meet a new governor, Festus, and then we're going to get to meet King Agrippa, but other than that, it's like even after 2 years, things are still exactly the same with Paul. It's like no progress has been made whatsoever. And now that Festus is in charge, it's like Paul has to start over from ground zero, and he's having to continue to defend himself against the same charges. The same Jews who hate him are bringing charges again, and it's just so frustrating to see the injustice that Paul is facing. And I just wonder if Luke writes this with the expectation that his readers will feel the frustration. And that's what I feel. I'm just annoyed by this chapter. I'm annoyed because this chapter shouldn't even be here. Paul should just be released from prison by now. Already should have been set free. But it's annoying to have to read this chapter because of the injustice and the evil that's going on here. So maybe that's part of why Luke writes this chapter the way that he does. It could also show Paul's continuation of Jesus' life, that Jesus also had to endure injustice at the hands of evil people. And, you know, with Jesus, obviously his injustice was very frustrating because he's the Son of God, and they're just mistreating God and getting ready to put him on the cross. Paul, his is frustrating, but his lasts way longer than Jesus's injustice did. You know, Jesus, yes, it was horribly unjust and awful, but at least it was over quickly. With Paul, it's been 2 whole years, and he's still in the exact same spot. There's absolutely zero progress that has been made, and it just drives me crazy. It should drive you as the reader crazy to feel some of what Paul himself must have felt. How frustrated Paul must have been at times that nothing is happening, and he's still here in prison. It also goes to show the power of evil and indifference toward the gospel in the world. That look how evil these Jews are, that even after 2 years have passed, the Jews in Jerusalem still want Paul dead. That's how much they hate him. Their hatred is unbelievable. It reminds me of the scene in The Lord of the Rings when King Theoden is locked up in Helm's Deep, and you know, he just looks around and he says, you know, there's so much death. And he says, what can man do against such reckless hate? And that's what these Jews are. They just got this reckless hatred to where 2 years have gone by. They still haven't let it go. They still seek opportunity now to sort of manipulate the new governor, because maybe the new governor doesn't really know what's going on. And they want to say, look, hey, if you want to get on our good side, well, then you just need to deliver Paul to us, and sort of using Paul as this political pawn to get the governor to do them a favor so they can kill Paul. And they still want him dead. It's unbelievable. But then you also have the indifference of the Roman governing officials, where Festus, you know, he's kind of indifferent about Paul being in prison. You know, it's like, big deal. I mean, he's sort of trapped because, again, he knows Paul's innocent, so he can't put Paul to death, and he can't let Paul go free, though, because he knows that's going to make the Jews angry. So, you know, he's kind of trapped, but ultimately he doesn't seem to care all that much what's going on here. So you've got evil, you know, hatred and indifference against the gospel. And maybe the last reason Luke writes this chapter is because this chapter is much more focused on Paul's loyalty to Caesar. The previous chapters were about Paul's loyalty to the law of Moses and to the God of the Jews and to Judaism as a whole. But here the emphasis is on Caesar, and that's because when they bring out false charges against Paul this time, there is something that changes, because in verse 8, when Paul defends himself, he says, I've committed no offense either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. So we're not really told what charges they bring against Paul here, but it seems like they've changed a little bit, and now they've added in that Paul is disloyal to Caesar, which again is kind of like what they did to Jesus. And they falsely accused Jesus of saying we shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar. And so now Paul is showing, no, I'm very loyal to Caesar. I'm a Roman citizen. And in fact, he's going to appeal to Caesar. So remember, Luke's main point in writing the Gospel of Acts, one of the main points is to show that Christianity is not anti-Judaism and it's not anti-Rome. And so this is sort of the anti-Rome chapter. He's going to mention Caesar like 8 times in this chapter, though sometimes he's called Caesar, sometimes he's called the emperor. But that's going to be sort of the focus of this chapter. That's just a big picture to sort of prepare you for a little bit of tediousness over the next few days in the daily Bible readings. But let's talk about Festus for a second. Festus, we don't know a whole lot about him, but we do know he came to power toward the end of 59 AD, and then he actually died a couple years later in 62 AD. So he didn't last in office for very long, but what we do know about him is that he was much more just and fair-minded than Felix was. And he's much more just and fair-minded than his successors. The governors that will come after him, they're going to be absolutely awful, and they're going to lead the Jews right into a war with the Romans, okay, and lead the Romans right into a war with the Jews, starting those Jewish wars in the late 60s, where obviously it culminates in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and all that in AD 70. So he's much more fair-minded. And of course, when he comes to power, the first thing that would be good for him politically is to get on the good side of the Jews. So the first thing he does is, when he comes, he goes to Jerusalem. He goes from Caesarea to Jerusalem to sort of meet with the Jewish leaders and say, hey, look, I'm the new governor. What's going on? Here's how we're going to work together. Here's how things are going to go. And they now request a favor from him. They ask him for a concession against Paul that they might bring him to Jerusalem. And here goes that plot to kill Paul, to ambush Paul, kill him on the way, just like they did years before. Except, this time the Sanhedrin seems, a little bit more involved in this than they were before. They sort of gave their permission before. Now it seems like they're the ones sort of taking the lead in this plot. And Festus won't do it, though. Oh, let me mention this, because maybe you've been wondering, whatever happened to those guys that made a vow not to eat or drink until they killed Paul? I mean, did they die? Because they never did kill him. Well, no. In their law, in their traditions, they actually had ways to get out of keeping a vow that was impossible to keep. And so they would have been fine. And so maybe they're sort of back at it again. Maybe it's these same guys that are like, all right, we're going to get him this time. And Festus isn't going along with it. Now, not 100% sure why he doesn't agree to send Paul to Jerusalem initially, because he's going to ask later if Paul wants to go to Jerusalem. Maybe it's just because he's setting some boundaries here, and he's showing his authority that, yeah, it may be in his interest to sort of throw the Jews a bone here, but at the same time, he doesn't want to just look like a pushover. And, oh, sure, Jews, you asked me to do something for you. Sure, I'll just do whatever you want. He may have also been filled in by Felix about this case. He knows Paul's a Roman citizen, and he knows really that it's his primary responsibility to hear Paul out. So, he doesn't agree with their plan, but he does agree, I will try Paul in Caesarea, but if you guys want to come down and bring charges against him there, I'll hear you out from Caesarea, which again is it's on repeat. Same thing has already happened with Felix. Here we go again. And they sure do. They come down, verse 7, they bring serious charges, which they could not prove. That's another emphasis here in this chapter, is that the more Paul's trial is rehashed, the more opportunities to show that Paul is innocent of any of these charges, to show that Christianity is exonerated from any false charges that have been brought against it. And Festus, he still wants to get on the Jews' good side, and so he asked Paul, look, would you like to go to Jerusalem, and have a trial there? And Paul's like, are you kidding me? Like, do you even know what has been going on here? And maybe he doesn't. Maybe he doesn't understand the full story of what has happened. That Paul has already tried to make his case in Jerusalem, and they just wanted him dead. And so what an absurd question. Do you want to go to Jerusalem? What are you, insane? And so Paul says no. In fact, he says, I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal right here in Caesarea. This is Caesar's court, right? I'm standing before you, Festus. You are a Roman governor. This is where I should be. Okay, and yet you've not found me guilty of anything. And I'm not afraid to go to Jerusalem. If I've actually done something wrong, like I'm not afraid of being punished for my wrongdoing. I just want a fair trial. And if you're not able to try my case here in Caesarea, okay, the solution is not for me to go to Jerusalem. No, I'm going to just get murdered there. Definitely not going to get a fair trial there. So since you can't seem to do anything for me here, then I appeal to Caesar. And this is an ages-long tradition that the Roman citizens had a right, if they, in extreme circumstances, okay, you couldn't just throw this around. You couldn't make appeals to Caesar, just whenever you wanted. In fact, it says something about the seriousness of this appeal that Paul waited 2 years to do it. Hey, Paul could have done it 2 years before. Maybe he waited because this is a serious thing that is reserved for, emergency situations, and, he doesn't want to get killed by the Caesar for misusing this appeal. But it could also be, maybe over those last 2 years, he thought, maybe I'll convert Felix, because Felix keeps having me in to hear the gospel, and I'm having more opportunities to preach to him, and so maybe there's hope for him. Obviously, that didn't work out at all, but maybe that's why he waited up to this point. But now the time has come. Paul realizes, I'm not going to get a fair trial, either here in Caesarea or in Jerusalem, so I appeal to Caesar. And he had now, by Roman law, he had to be shipped to Rome for trial, to stand before, Caesar's magistrates, and sometimes Caesar himself might actually even oversee the trial. And Nero himself may have overseen that trial. And, at this point in history, it's around 59, the end of 59, 60 AD. Nero hadn't quite gone off the deep end in his treatment of Christians yet. That's going to happen later in the 60s. So he may have a shot of having a reasonable trial at this point. So this is the plan now. And I don't think Festus would be happy about it, because implied in the appeal to Caesar is that there's a problem with the way that Festus has ruled. So Festus is hesitant about this. That's why he goes to his legal advisors. He's probably saying, how can I get around this? I don't want to send Paul to Rome, because that means Caesar's going to think ill of me, but hey, this has to happen. The legal advisors say, he appealed, he's got to go to Caesar. That's the plan. Let me just make this application. Don't be surprised when people hate you for telling them things they don't want to hear. Remember, Paul, he's preaching about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. People don't want to hear that. The Jews, they don't want to hear about Gentiles being saved, okay? Don't be surprised when people hate us for the gospel, and don't be surprised when people are indifferent and they just don't care what happens to us. They don't care that people hate us. They don't stand up for us, really. They just, are living their lives, and godly things, Christianity, the gospel, just don't make a bit of difference to them. We're going to face both of those things, and it's going to be frustrating. And we're going to feel like we're swimming upstream, and we're always fighting evil all the time, and it's going to be very tedious. The way Paul is frustrated and dealing with the tedium of these trials. But we're in good company, because Paul went through it. Jesus went through it. We're suffering for the sake of righteousness, and heaven, the glories of heaven, will be worth all of the tedium of this sin-cursed world. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. Today we're in Acts 25, verses 13 to 20, and like I said in yesterday's video, there's not a whole lot going on in today's reading. We've got a visit from King Herod Agrippa II, and Festus is just sort of wanting to get his opinion about Paul's case, because it's just been kind of a head scratcher for him. Paul seems innocent, but the Jews want him dead, and he can't figure out why, because Paul's a faithful Jew like they are. He's serving the same God. It's just that, he's got this belief in Jesus, who rose from the dead, and so he just really wants to get Herod's take on this. Now, I mentioned yesterday that maybe one of the reasons this chapter is so long and drawn out is that Luke wants to capture the frustration of what Paul is going through here. That as the reader, we sort of sympathize with Paul and realize this trial is going on forever. He should have already been set free. They should have at least had a decision by now. Either kill him or let him go, but don't just leave him in limbo. And that's very frustrating. But let me also add this. I think that one of the reasons this chapter feels so tedious to us is because we know what happens. We know Paul doesn't get killed here by King Agrippa. He actually does end up going to Rome. But if you're a first century reader of the book of Acts and you didn't really know the story, this is a great way for Luke to build tension and suspense in the story and wonder what's going to happen to Paul. Because remember, Jesus made a promise that Paul would go to Rome. And so many times in the Bible, whenever God makes a promise, there's always something that gets in the way and makes it seem like the promise is going to be impossible to fulfill. And as the reader, you're wondering, is God really going to make good on his promises? And it's the same thing here. Jesus made a promise that Paul is going to go to Rome, but now there's sort of a wild card because here's a new ruler, King Agrippa II. And if you know anything about the Herods, and we'll talk about that in a second, they've not been very friendly to God's people over the years. And so maybe Herod Agrippa is going to end up killing Paul. And Paul's not going to go to Rome. We don't really know that. If you're reading this for the first time in the first century world, it's kind of like in a scary movie when the character is walking down a really long, dark hallway. It's like the longer that walk goes, right? Usually they're walking really slowly down the hallway. And so the slower that character walks down that hallway, the more the tension and suspense is built because you don't know what's going to happen when he gets to the end of the hall. Is something going to jump out at him? What happens when he opens the door? And it's the same thing here with this chapter. This chapter is like a slow plod here. It's like, okay, we're just rehashing Paul's case over and over again. I had Paul's case. I didn't know what to do with him. Maybe I'll give you his case. Maybe you know what to do with him. Felix didn't know what to do with Paul. Lysias didn't know what to do with Paul. It's very tedious and slow plotting to build the suspense and the tension to see what is going to happen. Is King Herod going to kill Paul after hearing his case? Or will Paul actually go to Rome and Jesus make good on his promises? So I think that's really helpful to keep that in mind. Pretend you're a first century reader, never heard this before, and now you've got King Agrippa II here. Now, the Herods are a little bit difficult to keep track of because Herod was a family dynastic name. It was like a royal name, sort of like Pharaoh, where you would have multiple pharaohs, different individual people with their own names like Ramses and Tutmos and all that, but they were all pharaohs. They were still called Pharaoh. Same thing with the Herods. You would have different individual people with their own unique names like Agrippa II, but they were all Herods. And to me, it helps to match up the Herods with some of the major events in the New Testament. So, for instance, Herod the Great, he's the one who was killing babies when Jesus was born. He was the one trying to have Jesus killed by killing all of the, infants 2 years old and younger in the land. And Herod the Great is Agrippa II's great-grandfather. Herod Antipas was the one who had John the Baptist beheaded. And Herod Antipas was the one that Jesus stood before trial under. And then Herod Agrippa I, he was in Acts chapter 12. He's the one that killed James, the brother of John. He put Peter in prison, and then God struck him dead with worms. Herod Agrippa I from Acts 12, that's Herod Agrippa II's father. Okay? And so Herod Agrippa II also brings with him Bernice. And Bernice is his sister. And there was some suspicion in the ancient world that there's some inappropriate relationship going on between this brother and sister. Now, here's what else is interesting. Remember Felix's wife? Her name was Drusilla. Drusilla is Herod Agrippa II's sister. And Bernice is also her sister. Remember I said Drusilla was a looker. She was like a 10 out of 10. Bernice, her sister, who persecuted her and tormented her, was not a looker. She was like a 3, and that's why Bernice hated Drusilla so much, is because she was so much prettier, and so she wanted to make Drusilla's life miserable. And so this is the family we're talking about here. This is Drusilla and Bernice and Herod. They're all siblings. King Herod Agrippa, he's the king of Galilee and Perea, and also some other smaller areas. And he actually, as we continue reading, he's going to seem a little bit more reasonable than Herod the Great, who's out slaughtering babies, and he killed many of his own family members. He was, a real psycho. Same with Herod Antipas, really not good. Herod Agrippa, he seems a little more level-headed than those guys at least, and so maybe Paul will have, some shot at getting a fair hearing. And they're there, King Agrippa II and Bernice, they are there in Caesarea to sort of show their respect to Festus, because he's the new governor. And so this is just a good, smart political move to go welcome the new governor to the area. And this gives Festus an opportunity to say, hey, what do you think about Paul's case? Now, interestingly, King Agrippa II was also put in charge by the emperor of the temple in Jerusalem, sort of managing the affairs of the temple, managing the high priests, installing new high priests, deposing other high priests. And so he actually would have some knowledge of Jewish affairs. And so he would be a good person, really, for Festus to look to say, help me solve this Jewish problem. Because it is true, they sort of brought charges against Paul that he was against Caesar, right? We saw that in yesterday's reading. But for the most part, he realizes, verse 19, they had some points of disagreement about their own religion. Okay, that this is mostly a Jewish dispute, but the Jews, they've sort of made it into something political, and so this is really difficult for him to sort of iron out. Like, why are the Jews so angry at Paul when he's a Jew just like they are? And what does this have to do with Rome? Why are they making it out to seem like Paul is against Caesar? It's just a really sticky situation, and he wants advice from Agrippa about this. Now, let me make this application for us. Here's an example of Jesus and his providence taking care of Paul through the governing authorities. It's kind of like in Romans 13, where Paul says that the government is a minister of God to you for good, because the government is meant to destroy the wicked, right, and protect the innocent. And here, notice when the Jews asked Festus, hey, we want you to condemn Paul. We want you to, put him to death. He says in verse 16, I answered that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. So this is a great blessing, actually, to have Roman law being used for Paul's benefit to protect him from the whims of the Jewish mob. And I think this is a wonderful thing for us, even in our modern day, to thank God for our government. And I understand our government has a lot of problems, and it's really frustrating to hear some of the ridiculous policies that they talk about in the news and all that. I get all that. But at its core, we have a system of law that allows us to not just be murdered by angry mobs in the street. We actually have an opportunity to give a defense and to hear the accusations and to have a judge and to have a trial and to have lawyers. And again, I know sometimes our court system can be corrupt as well, but in general, it's so much better than just having no law to protect us, and anybody who's mad at us can just kill us. So that's a real blessing that we need to thank God for, not just in our own lives, but in Paul's life. Because this is the way that God and Jesus are making good on their promise to bring Paul to Rome. They're using the protections of the law to be a shield around Paul so that he's not unjustly killed by this mob. It's a beautiful thing. It's something to thank God for every day that we just take for granted in our country. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. Today we're in Acts 25, verses 21 to 27, and Luke continues to build tension here as we wait for Paul to give his defense speech to King Agrippa II. And we don't really get any new information in today's reading. It's just another rehashing of what we've already heard many times before. The Jews have brought charges against Paul. Festus found that he was innocent, and he's sort of wanting Herod now to weigh in on this case. Now, I understand it's repetitive, but Luke, I think this gives him another opportunity to show Paul is innocent. He is exonerated. He should not still be on trial. He's not against Rome. He's not against Judaism. This whole thing is just a sham at this point. And remember, Festus, he doesn't really care that much about Paul. If he cared about Paul, he would have let him go already because he knows that he is innocent. He's been using Paul as a political pawn just to keep the Jews happy. And so I think when he asks Herod to weigh in on this case, I don't think it's because he really cares about justice and he really wants to make sure to get this right. No, I think he's still playing political games because he knows he's going to be in trouble with Caesar. Paul has appealed to Caesar, and when Paul gets there, the implication is going to be that Festus didn't get the job done, that Festus couldn't decide this case and carry out justice on his own. And so I think by inviting Herod into this, and in fact gathering all of the leading men of the city at Herod's praetorium like he does in today's reading, I think he's sort of giving himself a political shield because he's getting more people involved. So when Caesar hears what happens, all the blame won't just fall on Festus. Festus can say, look, I'm not the only one who had a hard time with Paul's case. Herod Agrippa heard this as well, and it's just a difficult case, and he'll have, other people to sort of take the fall with him. And maybe there won't be as much a chance that Caesar will just kill them all, right? But if Festus is the only problem politically, then Caesar might, have him executed or at least have him removed from office. So this is a brilliant political move on Festus's part to have this whole crowd gathered to have Herod come. And verse 23, it says, when Agrippa came together with Bernice, it was amid great pomp and circumstance. I mean, this is a visit from a dignitary, and so they just go all out. Everybody's dressed to the nines. There may have been a parade and, maybe instruments playing and all that as they're sort of, parading themselves down the street until they enter into the praetorium, and now they're in the audience hall where Paul's going to stand trial. And, Felix, he kind of admits here that, I don't really know what to tell Caesar. I mean, if I send Paul away, it's going to be hard to explain exactly what's going on with his case because he doesn't fully understand the problem here and why the Jews hate Paul so much. It's really hard to make application from this section. Maybe the best I can come up with for today is that the devil often is the most sharp-dressed person in the room. Sometimes we think of the most evil people as dirty, rotten scoundrels, just sort of living in the back alleys, lurking in the shadows, seeking people to just jump out at and steal their stuff or whatever. But a lot of times the devil looks like the ultra-powerful, the rich and the elite, those that are super appealing and attractive to the eye. And here you just see a contrast between, Herod and Festus and all these leading men of the city where they're just so important looking. And then you got Paul standing right in the middle, who would have been not dressed super nice and may have been in chains and some, raggedy clothes potentially, but he is the one who is in the right here. He is the one who is the truly righteous one. All the ones that look great, right? The Devil Wears Prada, right? That was a novel and then later a movie. All the ones wearing Prada, they're the ones that are the wicked ones carrying out injustice here in this case. And I think it is interesting to see this contrast because Paul, he used to be one of those leading men. He used to have political connections and power and be a part of the Sanhedrin council and the leading people in Jerusalem. And he gave all of that up to now be the man in the middle with the crowd surrounding him, looking at him like a spectacle. And he's doing that because of Jesus. That sacrifice for Paul It's totally worth it for him. Paul doesn't care about the pomp and circumstance anymore. All he cares about is Jesus Christ and the resurrection. And it's just amazing to see that incredible life change in Paul. It's inspiring for us that sometimes our dream is to wear Prada. Our dream today is to be the most, rich and the most important and the most powerful, when really we just want to be right with Jesus. That's what matters the most. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. Today we're in Acts 26, verses 1 through 11, and you might be thinking, I'm so glad to be done with chapter 25 because of all the repetition and sort of the slow plod build up. The tension has been built up to the point where we're ready for Paul to go ahead and speak now. But then, now that he's speaking, you might be thinking, what are you doing to me, Luke? There's more repetition here? I mean, you're telling us Paul's conversion story again? Even though we just heard it back in Acts 22, and we had already heard his conversion story earlier in Acts chapter 9? What in the world is going on here, Luke? What are you doing to my daily Bible reading schedule? Well, let me mention a few things about this. First of all, it's not like these accounts are exactly the same. It's not like Luke is just copying and pasting from Acts 9 and then inserting that into Acts 22, and then copying and pasting Acts 22 right into Acts 26, so you're just reading the same thing. No, actually, if you'll notice, each account gets longer, and there are more details given each time this conversion story is told. So in Acts 9, that's the shortest version. It's the most abbreviated. It's actually in the third person because Luke is just reporting historically what happened to Paul. But then in Acts 22, it changes to the first person because it's Paul speaking. He's telling his story from his perspective, and he adds detail that we didn't get back in Acts 9, like how Paul was such a devout Jew raised at the seat of Gamaliel, and then it talks about baptism and how it washed away his sins, and there's just some other details there that we didn't get in Acts 9, and now in Acts 26, he gives us even more detail. For instance, this is the first time we're learning in Acts 26 and verse 9, that Paul genuinely thought he was supposed to be persecuting Christians. He thought that's what God wanted him to do. And we get that detail, and then in tomorrow's reading, we get the detail about Jesus talking about how Paul was kicking against the goads, which is a really neat image we'll talk about tomorrow, Lord willing. He talks about how the Jews and the Gentiles were in the dominion of Satan, and they were in the dark, and they needed their eyes to be open. This is all new detail. And again, I think some of this sounds so repetitive to us because we've heard it all before. But you got to put yourself in the shoes of a first century reader who doesn't know these stories. Every time Paul speaks and gives an account of his conversion, you would just be on the edge of your seat wanting to know more. Paul, tell us more about how in the world you went from being such an ardent opponent of Christianity to being one of the most ardent proponents of Christianity, spreading this gospel. It's an incredible story, and you just want to know more. And every time Paul gave you an additional detail and sort of satisfied that curiosity, you would be so delighted to learn more about Paul's story. And that's what Luke is doing for us here, each time telling the story, adding more details so we get a deeper insight into what was going on with Paul and also what was going on in Jesus' mind when he commissioned Paul. Because even the commission parts get longer and more detailed, so you learn more about what Jesus was wanting from Paul, what Jesus' will for Paul's life was. So that's all very exciting. Let me also share this with you. And this is just huge. I had never seen this before, thought about this before. Have to give credit to Mark Roberts for sort of showing this to me. But Luke repeats this 3 times in Acts, obviously because it's important. And what we see is that Paul's conversion story is the perfect encapsulation of the message of the book of Acts. And this is why it's repeated 3 times, because it perfectly tells us what the book of Acts is all about. So for instance, you notice 4 main themes. If you look at Acts 9, Acts 22, Acts 26, 4 main themes emerge, and they're the exact 4 same themes that the book of Acts as a whole is about. Number 1, Jesus is alive. Okay, how many times in the book of Acts are the sermons by Paul and even by others, which I know we didn't really look at Peter's sermons and stuff this year in DBR, but you look at all the sermons in Acts, they're all about the resurrection of Jesus, that Jesus is no longer dead. He rose 3 days later, victoriously, ascended up to heaven to sit at the right hand of the throne of God. And so in Paul's conversion story, you're seeing Jesus appearing to Paul on the road to Damascus, which means he is alive. He's standing in heaven with God. Okay, he's not dead. He's a risen Lord. He's a risen Savior. Okay, so that's the first theme that you see. The second theme that you see is that Jesus is the hope of Israel. That Jesus is what the Jews, what the Israelites have been hoping for centuries. He is the Jewish Messiah that all of the law and the prophets were pointing toward, which means Jews should be the ones most likely to become Christians. And in Paul's life, in his conversion story, you see the most devout Jew that there was. I mean, he is the Jew of Jews. He is the highest of his class, seated at the feet of the greatest teacher in Judaism that there was, Gamaliel, and he becomes a Christian. So, do you see how that supports the message of Acts that Jesus is alive and salvation is for the Jews? He came to save Jews. Thirdly, Jesus is the hope of the Gentiles, of all of the nations. That Jesus, yes, it's true, came to bring salvation to the Jews first, but also to the Greek, as Paul said in Romans chapter 1. And this is perfectly captured in Paul's conversion story, because Jesus, who is alive, he converts a Jew, saves a Jew named Paul, and then he sends that Jew to the nations, to the Gentiles, and says, I will make you my instrument to bring the gospel to the entire world. Just incredible to see all of that in Paul's conversion story. And then the fourth theme of Acts is you can't fight against Jesus and win. When you fight against Jesus and his church, you will lose. And that is a repeated theme all throughout Acts. Satan is constantly trying to attack the church, not just with Paul, but by other figures as well. And every time Satan tries to launch an attack against Jesus' church, it fails. And then when Paul comes on the scene and Satan tries to use Paul to persecute Christians and to stomp out the church, do you remember back in Acts chapter 8, the response to the persecution by Saul was that the Christians just scattered, preaching the gospel in other areas. So it was actually Saul's persecution that led to the growth of the church in other areas. Full confession, I listened to a radio station called 95.9, and it's positive hip-hop and R&B. And so it's rappers rapping about positive things, about godly things instead of, the things that rappers typically rap about. And I've always liked rap. My kindergarten teacher sent a letter home to my mother telling her that Brian really likes rhymey words. Okay, actually, I have that letter. My mom saved that letter. It's really funny, but that's why I like rap. I've always liked rap, and when I became a Christian, I sort of had to convert away from that and start to, listen to more positive rap. But anyway, there's a song, and there's a line in one of the rap songs that goes, if they murder us, it'll just send a surge of us to go put churches up. And that's what happened with Paul. He tries to fight against Jesus. He's murdering Christians. It sends a surge of them out to go establish more churches. Sorry, that was a long speech about my rap history. Probably not necessary. I'll go ahead and leave it in though, just for fun. But you see, Paul fighting against Jesus, it was only hurting himself. And we'll get that more tomorrow with the kicking against the goads language, but that's what you see all throughout Acts. In fact, the book of Acts ends with Paul in prison, preaching and teaching. The very last verse in Acts is Paul in prison in Rome, preaching and teaching, and the very last word in the book of Acts is unhindered. You cannot stop the growth of God's kingdom. And so, do you see why Luke might repeat Paul's conversion story 3 times? It's because it's got all 4 of those themes. Jesus is alive. He's the hope of the Jews. He's the hope of the Gentiles, and you can't fight against them. You can't stop his church. Just an amazingly powerful thing there when you understand. And that should then make us eager to hear Paul's conversion story in today's reading, even though we know many of the details already. But he starts to make his defense, and he says, I consider myself fortunate, King Agrippa, because he knows Agrippa is familiar with Jewish customs. He's familiar with the law. Remember, he was put in charge by the emperor of looking over the temple and a lot of Jewish affairs. And so Paul knows, I can talk to you about Judaism. When I start talking about Judaism, I know you're going to be connecting with me on my level. Paul knows how to read the room. He knows his audience, and he knows how to speak to them on their level. That's such an important skill for us to have as well. And he asked permission. I beg you to listen patiently. He knows this is going to take a little bit of time. And I think that's good for us too sometimes to ask people, hey, can I just take 30 seconds, and tell you why I believe in Jesus, and just respect their time by asking permission. And sometimes, a lot of times, people will respect the fact that you ask them, and they will actually be willing to listen. So he asks permission, he gives them permission, and then verse 4, he tells them, look, I've been an incredibly devout Jew. I lived as a Pharisee. I was the strictest of all the Jews. Okay, I was, raised as a Pharisee, super strict. So Paul's not saying he's sort of a fringe Jew that didn't really take the law very seriously, but he found this Christianity stuff and he thought, this sounds better than Judaism. That's not Paul at all. He's super strict about Judaism. If anybody would be defending Judaism against Christianity, it should be Paul. And that absolutely was what he was doing. Okay, but he has now realized Christianity is the culmination of Judaism. And really, Christianity is the fulfillment of the hope that all of the Jews have been waiting for, which he says in verse 6, that's why I'm on trial, for the hope of the promise made by God. God made that promise that one day I will send your seed, Abraham, to be a blessing to all the nations. That's what Paul is on trial for, that hope. And of course, connected with that seed promise in the Jews' mind, the coming of the Messiah also meant the resurrection of the dead in the end, to glory, to live with God in the world to come. Paul's saying, this is what I'm on trial for. Okay, the difference though is Paul understands that Jesus is the fulfillment of that hope. But the Jews have a disagreement about that. The Jews are still waiting for somebody else to come bring that hope in. And Paul is just amazed that the Jews in the audience, verse 8, it sounds like he's turning to the audience now. When he says you, it's plural. So he's not just talking to Herod now, he's talking to the whole audience. He's saying, why is it so hard for you to believe that God raised this man from the dead? God absolutely has the power to resurrect people from the dead. Why is it so hard to believe that he raised Jesus from the dead? That is really the core issue. The issue is not, is Judaism under attack here? No, the issue is, how is the hope of the Jews fulfilled? And Paul's saying it's fulfilled in Jesus. The Jews disagree with him. That's why he's on trial. And Paul, again, he's relating to the Jews and he's saying, look, I understand why you're so against Christianity, because I used to be against Christianity too. In fact, I thought that it was God's will that I would actually go and persecute Christians. I thought I was doing the right thing by persecuting Christians. And so he relates to the Jews on their level and says, look, I've been where you are. I understand why you're so angry, but you need to understand, okay, that this is the real deal, that Jesus is the Messiah. And he'll get into that in tomorrow's reading, but he continues to talk about how against Christians he was, to the point of locking them up in prison and casting his vote against them to be put to death, and then also trying to force them to blaspheme. I mean, he's not just locking them up in prison or consenting to their death. He's actually saying, look, you can be free. I will let you go if you denounce your faith in Jesus. And these Christians refuse to do it. And that's why Paul says, I was furiously enraged at them. The more Paul fought against Christians, the angrier he got, because he realized his efforts were futile and he can't fight against God and win. And here's the application for today. focus on hope as well in our presentation of the gospel. I know a little bit ago when we were talking about Felix, I talked about the need to mention sin to people, right? We can't leave out sin when we're talking to people. But we also want to make sure that we counterbalance the sin talk with hope. If we're just talking about sin, well, now, if that's all we're talking about, well, now it just sounds like we're condemning them and now it's hopeless for you and you're going to be eternally lost. We want to make sure to talk about hope. And hope is such an important topic in today's world because so many people are so hopeless and they don't, they vote somebody in office thinking that, hey, they're going to save the country and everything's going to get better, and then things just get worse. And they just realize, man, things just don't seem to be looking good for the future of my life or the future of my children's life. And people are craving hope. They're craving meaning and purpose in this world. And now we can tell them you can not only have the hope of your sins washed away and to be restored back in relationship with God and have the hope that comes with a righteous life, but also the hope of a future to come where there is no more suffering, there is no more pain and death. God will restore all things. We'll have perfect peace with Him for all eternity. And Paul, he considers it a blessing. He says, I'm fortunate to be able to share this message. And I think we need to have that same attitude Paul has, that I'm fortunate to go tell people about the hope that Jesus brings, because there's hope in no one or nothing else but Jesus. Really encouraging. I'll see you tomorrow. Today we're in Acts 26, verses 12 through 21. And remember, in yesterday's reading, we talked about why Luke is repeating Paul's conversion story 3 times in Acts. And that's because it encapsulates the major themes in Acts. First of all, Jesus is alive. Second of all, Jesus is the hope of the Jews. Third, He's the hope of the Gentiles. And fourth, you cannot fight against Jesus and win. And while I mentioned those being 4 themes of Acts, I want to add to that today and suggest to you that's actually the flow of the entire book of Acts works through those 4 points. So Acts chapters 1 and 2 is about how Jesus is alive. Remember Acts chapter 1, that's when Jesus, He's still with His disciples for 40 days after His resurrection, and then He ascends into heaven as they watch Him go. And He also told them, look, once I go to heaven, I'm going to send the Holy Spirit. And He does that in Acts chapter 2. And then when Peter preaches his sermon, his message is, Jesus is alive. Jesus has resurrected from the dead. And because of the resurrection, God has proven that He is both Lord and Christ. And then you see that the gospel starts with the Jews. Jesus is alive. Jesus is the hope of the Jews. So you got 3,000 Jews that are baptized in Acts 2. And then as you sort of trace through Acts, all the way really through chapter 7, the gospel is going to Jews, and then in chapter 8, it starts to spread out to Samaria, and then in Acts 10, it goes to the first Gentile, and then Paul, of course, takes the gospel to the Gentiles for the rest of the book of Acts. So you've got Jesus is alive, He's the hope of the Jews, He's the hope of the Gentiles, and then for the rest of the book of Acts, we see Satan trying to stop Jesus, trying to stop the spread of the kingdom, and it fails every time because you can't fight against Jesus and win. So I just think it's awesome to see not only does Paul's conversion story capture the main themes of Acts, it actually captures and outlines the flow of the book itself. Really, really powerful. And remember, each time we read this conversion story, Paul is giving us additional details that we did not have before. And so now, as he's speaking, he talks about the appearance of Jesus on the road to Damascus, and Jesus says something to him here that we did not get in the earlier accounts. And that is, he says to him in verse 14, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. A goad was a sharp stick that a farmer would use to get his ox moving in the right direction, and sometimes just moving at all. Right? If an ox decides, I don't really feel like plowing the fields today, I'm just going to stand here. Well, that ox is a lot bigger than you, so you're not going to be able to wrestle him into submission. So what they would do is they'd take a sharp stick and they would just stab him in the hindquarters to be uncomfortable. The idea wasn't to, injure the ox or to draw blood, but just to be uncomfortable enough to get him moving in the right direction so that the ox would actually do the will of the farmer. But sometimes that ox would be stubborn and say, you know what? I don't want you poking me with that stick. and I'm still not going to plow the field. So next time you poke me with that stick, I'm going to kick that stick out of your hand, or I'm going to kick you. But then what happens sometimes is when the ox kicks against the goad actually does injure the ox because it stabs him in the leg, and it does draw blood, and it does hurt. And so by the ox refusing to do the farmer's will and kicking against the goad, the ox is only hurting himself. And that's a perfect image to describe Saul, because God apparently, and this is what's so awesome about this illustration, apparently Jesus had been goading Saul for a while, trying to get Saul to do his will. But Saul continued stubbornly disobeying Jesus, and instead of doing Jesus' will, he continued to do his own will and to persecute Christians. But the more he kicked against the proddings of Jesus, the more it hurt himself. And he ended up only filled with rage. We read yesterday in verse 11, he was just furiously enraged. And it may lead us to ask, in what ways was Jesus prodding and goading Saul before he became a Christian? Well, maybe several answers to that. How about number one, his devotion to the law of Moses? The more you learn about the law of Moses, the more you're seeing Jesus. Okay, the law of Moses, remember, in Galatians chapter 3, is a tutor that leads us to Christ. So Jesus actually has been using Paul's upbringing to be an expert in the law, even to sit at the feet of Gamaliel in order to teach Paul about Jesus from an early age, even though Paul didn't fully understand that. It didn't really register with Paul that he was learning about Jesus this whole time, but that's absolutely what God was doing, using the law to teach Paul about Jesus. Also, you have Jesus himself. We don't have any record of Paul encountering Jesus personally, but Jesus was on his earthly ministry for 3 years, and he was there in Jerusalem for all of the feasts, the 3 yearly feasts, and Paul would have been there. There's no way that Paul would have never heard about Jesus or heard any of Jesus's teachings. Maybe he didn't meet him personally, but for sure he knew about Jesus, and he would have heard those teachings, and that's a way that Jesus was goading Saul. I also think Saul's failure was a way to goad him, that the more Saul persecuted the church, the more the church continued to grow. And that too was a goad to sort of convict Paul, to show your efforts are futile. You're trying to fighting against the church is fighting against God, and that's not going to work. Okay, even his teacher Gamaliel, and we didn't cover this year in DBR, but way back in Acts chapter 5, remember Gamaliel actually speaks up, and he tells the Sanhedrin council, because they're trying to persecute the apostles, he tells them, look, if you're fighting against God, like this will never work. You cannot fight against God and win. And that's what was happening for Saul. And maybe the straw that broke the camel's back was Stephen. That when Saul was consenting to Stephen's death and watching Stephen be stoned to death, he would have seen Stephen's incredible attitude, how he imitated Christ in the way that he died, with humility. And he's actually praying to God to forgive his persecutors. It's just it would have been an incredible thing for Paul to see somebody living this way and dying this way. And I think all of those things served to goad Saul's heart along the way, but he just kept resisting until finally Jesus appears to him. It's sort of the final goad that pushes Paul over the edge to see Jesus in all of his glory, standing there alive in heaven, speaking to him. This would have pushed him over the edge and finally got him to realize, okay, I've got to stop being a stubborn ox. I need to serve Jesus. And he talks about this total 180-degree turn. And interestingly, in this account, he doesn't talk so much about his conversion. He doesn't really talk about his baptism at all here. He focuses mainly on his commission, especially his commission to the Gentiles. And this is really, really wise, because Paul is speaking to a primarily Gentile audience right now. Certainly there are Jews there listening to Paul's speech, but Herod and Bernice, right? These are people who are Gentiles, and they would be much more receptive to this message. And in fact, he's going to make the Jews into the enemies of the Gentiles, because he's going to say, look, Jesus commissioned me to preach the gospel to the Gentiles, but the Jews are trying to stop me from doing that. That's why I'm in prison, because the Jews don't want me bringing the message of salvation to the Gentiles. So think about how that would make Herod feel. Like that's unfair. Paul's just trying to help us. He's trying to help us find God, and the Jews aren't letting him do it. So it's really brilliant how Paul does this. Again, he's speaking to different audiences. That's why the details are different in these conversion accounts, because in Acts 22, he was speaking to a Jewish audience. It was the Jewish mob. Here, he's got Gentiles to consider. So, verse 14, he had fallen to the ground with the group, but then Jesus tells him in verse 16, get up and stand on your feet. What's neat is his commission here is parallel to the commission of some of the Old Testament prophets, like Ezekiel, for instance. In Ezekiel 1, he sees this vision of the glory of God, and it's so overwhelming that he falls to his face. But then God tells him in Ezekiel 2 and verse 1, stand up on your feet. There's no way Paul would have missed that parallel. Paul and the Jews, they would have seen that parallel. And there's some parallels also with Jeremiah, because Jesus tells him in verse 17, I'm going to rescue you from the Jews. And God told Jeremiah the same thing in Jeremiah 1:8, that I'm going to deliver you from the people, right? It didn't mean that Jeremiah or Paul would not suffer. Of course they would suffer. But the point is, God would not allow the Jews to stop him from carrying out this commission. And that's what Jesus is doing for Paul. He's currently rescuing Paul from the hands of the Jews. Now, he's still suffering. He's still got thrown in prison. He's been in prison for 2 years. Okay, but Jesus is going to make sure that the Jews cannot stop his commission to the Gentiles from being fulfilled. And here he is, despite the Jews' best efforts. And by the way, all the Jews, they're kicking against the goads too, trying to stop Paul, but it doesn't work out for them, because every time they try to stop Paul, Paul just has a new audience. And now he's got an audience with King Agrippa II, right? And the whole town, with all the fanfare and pomp, has gathered to hear this message. So Jesus absolutely is making good on his promise to rescue Paul from the Jews, to allow him to carry out this commission. He says, I'm sending you to the Gentiles. That word sending, that connects him to the ministry of Isaiah, right? That there was a lot of language about God sending Isaiah. Isaiah says, here am I, send me. Okay, so he's got a mission to go enlighten and open the eyes of the blind Gentiles who are sitting in darkness, and they're in the dominion of Satan, that they might have the forgiveness of sins, that they might also receive an inheritance among those who are holy and sanctified by God. And Paul says, look, at that point, once I knew Jesus is alive, I did not prove disobedient to the heavenly vision. I was not going to kick against the goads anymore. I'm ready to go. I'm all in on Jesus at that point. And so I started to preach the gospel, first in Damascus, then in Jerusalem, then Judea, and then to the Gentiles, that everybody should turn to God. And I love it that turning to God isn't just a matter of, well, I just believe God exists. It's repenting of your sins. It's changing directions completely, just the way Paul changed directions. And now you're performing deeds worthy of repentance. You're demonstrating to God that I have changed, because I'm no longer, like Paul, persecuting Christians. Now I'm going and I'm supporting Christians. I'm establishing churches. I'm living in a totally opposite direction now. That's what repentance is all about. And again, he tells Herod, this is why the Jews hate me so much. This is why I'm in prison, because they are trying to keep me from bringing salvation to the Gentiles, which again is so brilliant by Paul, making the Jews out to be the bad guys here. Okay, Paul is not the bad guy. He's trying to rescue people, to open people's eyes and bring them to God. The Jews are trying to stop people from coming to God because they hate the idea that Gentiles can become a part of God's kingdom without becoming Jews. That God and Jesus would love Gentiles as much as they love Jews. That is just absolutely unacceptable to them. That's why they've got Paul in prison. So Herod Agrippa and Festus here Well, they're getting a lot more information because remember, Festus, he wanted to know more, and this is giving him an opportunity to really have his eyes open to see this is what is really the problem. He didn't understand. Festus didn't understand why the Jews hated Paul so much. Paul's explaining this is why. They hate my commission to the Gentiles. Here's an application for us. Are we kicking against the goads? Sometimes we know God's will for us, but we are like the stubborn ox who refuses to work and do God's will. But the problem is we only end up hurting ourselves, and we end up running into all sorts of obstacles and dead-end roads, and we're not filled with any sort of peace. We end up maybe furiously enraged like Paul was, and all the while God is trying to goad us into action, and he uses the scripture maybe to goad us. Maybe our daily Bible reading is goading us to get us to do God's will. Maybe brothers and sisters in Christ say something to us that is convicting to us. Maybe failures in our lives where we do just kind of keep running into a wall, it seems, in our efforts to do things our own way and not do things God's way. That's God goading us. Jesus wants to get us to stop our stubbornness and start moving in the right direction, and because he loves us, he gently goads us in that direction, and the longer we resist him, the more we hurt ourselves. And so the best thing to do is to say, okay, Lord, I'm not going to prove disobedient to you anymore. I'm going to actually obey you. I'm going to stop being that stubborn ox, and then we'll go like Paul, from being people furiously enraged and frustrated at all the failures and the lack of peace, to a person filled with the peace and the joy of knowing I'm right with God. Even if we do still face obstacles like Paul did in challenging circumstances, we can still be at peace because we know we're at peace with God. We are not resisting him anymore. We've turned to him, and now we're performing deeds worthy of repentance. Hope that's helpful. Have a great weekend. I'll see you on Monday.